Добрый вечер всем.
Good evening, everybody. Our media hub continues its work, and right now in our studio we have Olga Stefanishina, Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine for European and Euro-Atlantic integration, and our guest Pramila Patten, Special Representative of the UN Secretary General on sexual violence in conflict times. The subject of our today's briefing is support and assistance for those victims of sexual violence during war. So, Ms. Stefanishina, you have the floor. Thank you, dear colleagues. Today, indeed, we have had a very productive day interacting with the special representative of Secretary General to the UN. Under Secretary of the UN on sexual violence during wartime. We were preparing for this meeting for a long time, and we have agreed upon several important things. First of all, we have signed a memorandum about urgent mechanisms of cooperation, more strategic ways of interaction. Today, unfortunately, we hear a lot about cases of sexual violence, not only about women residing in occupied territories, in those territories occupied by the Russian Federation, but also against children, against older people, and even against men, against males. And it makes us rearrange all governmental resources to properly provide support to such people. We already know that there has been rather large-scale activities of law enforcement, system law enforcement agencies. All those crimes that we could document have been documented. At the same, during our today's meeting, we were focusing on providing assistance, psychological assistance, medical assistance, medicines to citizens who notify of such cases, and establishing a system to collect together such information. Because, as the special representative also confirmed today, these are types of crime which are basically not documented during wartime. So for us as a government, it is important to launch wide-scale activities to document those cases and to provide necessary assistance. And as a first step, we have been planning to deploy all over Ukraine, first of all in those places where there are a lot of displaced persons, in those places where Ukrainian citizens come through green corridors, through evacuation corridors, and also in those territories of Ukraine that have been liberated from Russian occupation. To work with such citizens, we will deploy places for them to receive psychological, medical, medicines, and legal support. Those are urgent measures that we are starting to implement now. Also, since the beginning of this war, we have already deployed 24 teams for social and psychological support. They have already been working across Ukraine with such citizens, and of course, based on what we initiated today, the special representative will develop concrete recommendations which will make the foundation for policies in this area. And I also hope that UN resolutions will be reviewed about crimes committed during wartime. Thank you. Ms. Pramila Patten, you are welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I would really like to thank all the media present this afternoon. In a very silent weapon. It's biological warfare, it is psychological warfare. So my question, my appeal to victims is that you are not responsible for what has happened to you. And you should shift the stigma back to the perpetrators. It is a calculated act by perpetrators who know that you will keep silent, who know that you will not report, and hence they will enjoy total impunity. And this cannot go on. So I'm here to express my solidarity with all of you, that you are not alone, that the United Nations stand in solidarity with you. My office stand in solidarity with you. My promise to you is that international law will not be an empty promise. Today's documentation will be tomorrow's prosecution. And I want you to know that your rights don't end when wars begin. Women's rights don't end when wars begin. Your bodies are not battlefield and must never be treated as part of the battlefield. And International humanitarian law makes it clear that even wars have limits, and sexual violence is beyond the scope of acceptable conduct, even in the midst of war. These limits have been universally agreed upon and must be universally respected. They include a categorical prohibition on all forms of sexual violence, which can never be excused, which can never be justified, or never be amnestied. My mandate was created by the UN Security Council over a decade ago to address the scourge of conflict-related sexual violence as a threat to both individual and collective security and an impediment to a just and durable peace. Wartime rape can no longer be dismissed as an inevitable byproduct of war. It must be recognized by all parties as a crime that can be prevented and punished. I am deeply concerned by the emboldening effects of impunity, and it is critical that all actors and parties know that the world is watching. Today, I am very pleased that I signed with the Deputy Prime Minister a framework of cooperation with the government of Ukraine to support the design and delivery of priority interventions in the areas of justice and accountability as a central pillar of deterrence and prevention, multi-sectoral service provision for all survivors, including sexual and reproductive health services, medical and specialized mental health services, legal assistance, and livelihood support. The prevalence of sexual violence in conflict throughout history teaches us that reinforcing prevention, protection, and service delivery is critical from the onset of any armed conflict. The third area of priority identified is gender-responsive security sector reform, also prevention of conflict-related trafficking. Ukraine is facing a displacement crisis unprecedented in speed and scale. It is a fact that conflict does exacerbate vulnerability to trafficking, and human trafficking of Ukrainian women can be a dangerous byproduct of this conflict-fueled refugee crisis. There is therefore a critical need to put in place risk mitigation measures to prevent this humanitarian crisis turning into a human trafficking crisis. My role is to amplify the voices of women affected by war, and indeed all survivors of sexual violence, and bridge them to global decision-making bodies such as the United Nations Security Council, the Human Rights Council, and the wider donor and diplomatic community. I will raise these concerns with all policymakers that have the power to convert these facts and findings into accountability and action. Thank you.
Пані спеціальний представник.
Ms. Special Representative, I'd like to thank you for being here with us, for visiting our country, for working and helping us and supporting us during this extremely difficult time. Dear journalists, you're welcome to ask your questions, so you're welcome. Please use the microphone and introduce yourself.
This is to Ms. Stefanishina. I'm Marinos Gassiamis from Mega TV, Greece. Is there any current number of sexual assaults against women, children, and old people here in Ukraine?
Can you please repeat the beginning of the question? I just didn't got.
Чи є якісь цифри щодо сексуального насильства?
Can it be repeated, if you don't mind?
Repeat.
Is there any current number of sexual assaults against women, children, and old people?
Дійсно, сьогодні ми можемо говорити лише про цифри.
Today we can only talk about the numbers documented within criminal cases initiated, and as I already mentioned, as the Special Representative already mentioned, this is one of the issues that we will be handling, because this is one of the most silent types of crime, and it's very difficult to gather information about this type of crime. Today we have started working to gather this information using volunteers, working with medical facilities, and documenting these cases. outside of the criminal proceedings. So I am not to mention any specific numbers now. There are numbers within the criminal proceedings, and there are several dozens of cases, but there is also a huge number of cases which have already been documented in medical protocols by civil society, by volunteers, but we are just starting developing mechanisms how to gather this information and how to provide those numbers. It's very difficult, unfortunately, to provide any consolidated numbers. Ms. Stefanishina, very often with working with journalists, we have some misunderstanding indeed, because there are certain facts, there are certain numbers documented, and to document those crimes, we need to have a criminal proceedings against the person who perpetrated such crime. And indeed, many victims do not approach law enforcement agencies to initiate such criminal proceedings. We had our ombudsman with us, Lyudmila Denisova, and she also mentioned that there are many cases like that. Do you cooperate? Do you discuss it with the ombudsman office? Of course. Literally today we had a broad meeting with all governmental authorities. We maintain permanent contact with the Ombudsman office, with our civil society, with international organizations, with the UN organizations, and with the Prosecutor General office, and with the International Committee of Red Cross. So that's why I'm saying that every party has a lot of information, and we understand that there are such cases of rape, and documenting this information is not just about criminal cases as such, but as the special representative mentioned, it's very important to emphasize two things. It's very important to develop a system to collect this information for us to be able to turn it into specific liability through procedural mechanisms. And second, unfortunately, we have to state that for Russian armed forces, this is just part of crimes against civilians, which is a component of their warfare. Although indeed it's just violation, it's rape against particular people. So we are talking about cases which have been documented, but not always those cases have become criminal cases. So to that end, indeed, in the regions we are to deploy support centers where not only people who have been victims of sexual violence, but also people who have been victims of all types of violence will be able to receive free support, psychological support, mental support, and they will be supported after all those procedures. Thank you. You're welcome. Ms. Stefanishina, could you please tell us, about 3 weeks ago there was some information whereby about 40 children have been saved, rescued from Mariupol, and they have been raped, and there have been both boys and girls. Is there any information about the fate of those children? Can you comment on that? And I have a question for the Special Representative. A lot has been said about rights of women and their protection for them, but there's rape not only against women, but also against men, against males and children. And as far as we know, no one perpetrator has been punished in the Russian army, and we have even heard that it's incentivized there. Do you have any ideas how we could bring it to the end, because we have some information that those activities continue. I will be brief. This information is now being verified. Unfortunately, I cannot share any details.
Right. On the question regarding data, I just want to pick up from what the Vice Prime Minister said, is that from the perspective of the UN and from my own perspective, we cannot expect to have accurate bookkeeping during on an active battlefield. And I do not wait for hard data and statistics to act. I think we really need to do everything to provide the necessary services to the victims. You are absolutely right to say that sexual violence is perpetrated against women and girls significantly, but there are men and boys who are also victims, and I have received reports, not yet verified by the United Nations, about sexual violence cases against men and boys in Ukraine. And I am working with the different UN agencies to ensure that there are services adapted to the needs of men and boys. Because everywhere in many conflict situations, I have observed that there is a lack of services adapted to the needs of men and boys. And this is why I am actively working with different UN agencies to make sure that we have a survivor-centered response. That is, we understand specific experience of the particular survivor and bring the relevant services. And let me tell you that it's even harder. It's hard for women and girls to report because of stigma, amongst other reasons. It's even harder for men and boys to report. So we have to create that enabling environment. We have to create that safe space for men and boys, for all victims to report cases of sexual violence.
Дякую.
Thank you, you're welcome.
From The Guardian. There's been some extremely disturbing reports of women who have been raped before being murdered. And I just wondered, I mean, you've been talking about survivors, but it seems there are also, you know, tragically victims of sexual violence who are not survivors, who are, you know, no longer alive. I just wondered, how is that part of your work? How are you making sure that those individuals get counted? How are you reflecting them in the work that you're doing? Thank you.
Well, indeed, these reports are extremely disturbing, and as I said earlier, this is why I'm here. I could not sit back in New York and watch this unfold here in Ukraine. I have followed the press conference by the Prosecutor General when I was still in New York, and this morning I had the very first meeting was with her, and there is, it appears, forensic evidence, solid evidence of women whose bodies have been found, and with evidence indicating rape. This is very serious, and the United Nations, through this framework of cooperation that we have signed, will not spare any effort to bring perpetrators to justice. Of course, there are challenges. It's never easy to prosecute cases of sexual violence. I met with a significant number of NGOs today who shared with me anecdotal reports of sexual violence. For example, one NGO representative was referring to cases where the perpetrator wore a mask. So identification becomes extremely difficult. There are many challenges, but for sexual violence cases, there are even more challenges. But for me, the priority, and I just came back from a meeting with the Ombudsman for Human Rights. I think what is critical, because whatever reports are surfacing, they can only represent the tip of the iceberg, and that kind of silence will only embolden the perpetrators, and that's why I want to place the focus on reporting. Today's documentation is tomorrow's prosecution, and I had a thorough discussion with the Office of the Ombudsman for Human Rights to see to what extent her office could take the responsibility to have hubs around the country, that safe space that we talk about for victims, men, women, children, to come forward to report cases with the necessary support services, be it in the form of medical, psychological support, legal assistance, and other appropriate services that are required. And her office was very receptive. She was personally very receptive. And that will also take care of the problem of people without the skill set interviewing victims, and with the huge risk of re-traumatizing and re-victimizing victims, which must be avoided at all costs. We have to learn lessons from the other conflicts where this has been the case, with victims interviewed over 10 times, 15 times, with all the inconsistencies in the reports, which make their case not tenable in a court of law. We all have to work. With every war, we say never again. I think this time we have to say never again and mean it, and take the necessary action to give justice to these victims of sexual violence.
Я тільки додам,
I will just add that all those bodies of those civilians identified and exhumated in the territories controlled by the Ukrainian government have been studied through forensic examination for any signs of sexual rape. So all those citizens identified, all those bodies which were exhumated, they have all been reviewed. And even for those dead bodies, we have this information, and those procedures have already been initiated.
If I may add, the International Commission of Inquiry mandated by the Human Rights Council will soon be deployed, and all this information will be shared, and they will also be looking into these cases.
Дякую.
Thank you. Thank you. Any more questions? Thank you. Thank you for finding time to join us here for this press briefing. Thank you for being here, and thank you for raising those extremely important topics. Thank you. Friends, please stay with us. Now we are developing a schedule of our press briefings for tomorrow, so you're welcome, and see you.